What you are about to witness is the creation of many, 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 many cats for my gigantic Artfight mass attack. Hey, I'm Bella and I'm a 3D artist. Yes, I know that Artfight ended like 3-4 weeks ago now at this point, but I was so busy working on this piece that I didn't even find the time to edit any videos as I was going. So what is Artfight? It's an annual art event where participants are split into two different teams and they earn points for their teams by attacking other players, aka drawing the other players' characters. I first participated in Artfight back in 2015, but since I drifted away from 2D digital art into 3D art and just generally being quite busy in life, I haven't really thought about participating again, but I always had a reminder in my phone to remind me that that time of year was coming up again. And so long story short, I had some inspiration this year, and since 3D art has its own classifications and a place in Artfight, I really didn't have an excuse this year. So what I'm working on now is sketching out a whole bunch of cats. I've never drawn cats before, so it definitely took a little bit to get into the groove, but I'm basically just scrolling through Pinterest and picking out some cool poses to sketch, some that are funny and silly goofy ones, some that are just absolutely ridiculous, and some that are a little bit more normal, a little bit more cute, and I'm just Tetrising them in together piece by piece. It's around this point as well that I color code some of the running themes throughout the sketch. There's the fence post kitties that are scattered on the bottom of the page, the tree kitties who are, well, in a tree, some climbing and then some sleeping, and then there's the yarn kitties. And since I also put in a few cats in silly hats, these kitties are all playing with a piece of string that is being pulled out of the cat in the yellow flower hat. There's a few duo poses throughout for pairs of cats interacting, and then in the middle there is a trio, which ended up being one of my favourite poses. I aimed to fit 100 cats in this piece, since when submitting an Artfight attack you can declare up to 100 different characters included, but I only ended up fitting 83 in the sketch. At the time, I figured that was a good thing because that's still a lot of cats, and it's a little bit less work in case I don't finish it in time or if I get burnt out. So now I've got a nice sketch to guide me, but this artwork isn't going to be in 2D. No, no, no. I'm a 3D artist, remember? So I need a cat model. I liked the style direction that I started going with for the cats that I modeled for my VTuber. I didn't have a solid idea in my mind, and I just kind of went for it in the same place that all good things start, with a cube. I do not really have a method to my madness. I just kept poking and prodding at it to kind of get it into the shape that I wanted, that shape being round and squishy. I'm working from big to small, so focusing on the overall big shapes first before zoning in and working on the smaller, finer details. Once I'm at least happy with the shape of the head, I extrude out a neck and into the body, and then from the sides come the shoulders, front legs, paws, thighs, back legs, and paws. Overall, I'm mainly just keeping this simplified, stylized, nothing too realistic, but most of all easy to work with in the future. This base model is going to be the base for all of the many, many cats to come, so I try and think ahead for things that will just make my life easier along the way, but I'm also taking a lot of extra care so that way I don't have a lot of fixing up of things to do in the future. This bit looks like a real mess, but because I've got a few cats sketched out that are yawning or just have their mouths open, I need to model what's called a mouth bag, basically just a sphere on the inside of the mouth. What made this a lot easier to work on is selectively hiding anything that's in the way, working on whatever bit that I'm working on, and then hiding another part, working on that bit. The eyes I struggled with so much. Again, I'm going in the route of something cute and chibi and simple, but it just wasn't working for me for quite a while. The base of the eyes is made with just a circle mesh with a solidify modifier on it, which gives it depth, and then a whole lot of reshaping and positioning to try and get it looking right. I put it in the I just need to trust the process basket, and then I move on so I can come back to it with some fresh eyes later. I make a couple of whiskers out of simple planes, extruded and with the subdivision modifier, and then I move on. UV unwrapping is where we're going to take this 3D model, cut it up into pieces, and arrange those pieces on a 2D surface so that we can map an image over the model. The unwrapping itself isn't anything too crazy. I'm basically just cutting out the main pieces, like separating the head, each of the legs, the tail, but the most important thing is that I need to have my mirror modifier applied so that the left and the right pieces don't overlap and take up the same space, and that way the texture of the cats themselves can be non-symmetrical when I want it to be. The next step is to move on to making the rig. I'm keeping it simple but hoping it will be able to move into all the poses that I need it to. It's helpful to look at real life skeletons to see where the true joints are and how they should articulate. I have the shoulder and the hips separated from the spine so that I can move them freely if I need to rather than just rotating, and spoiler alert, this does majorly come in handy for quite a few of the poses. I really roughly parent each part of the mesh to the respective bones, and then I go and refine as it's needed. It's handy to set up a few keyframes or poses to see how things move and deform as I'm going through and repainting it manually. And now it's time for the fun part. I figured a good place to start was with my own two cats, Sophie and Fran, starting off with Fran. And this did end up being a good idea since I'm familiar with them and it gave me some confidence, but I also found some things along the way that just needed to be fixed up and adjusted before moving on to all of the other cats. I have my way of texturing, it works for me, and I have a good system for how I like to work. There's probably better ways to do it, and I often get comments saying that I'm brave for texturing in Blender, but it is what it is. I like roughly blocking in colours so that way I can see how it's going to look on the model, then editing it in Clip Studio Paint, my 2D editor of choice, to smooth things out and refine it. Another benefit of painting the texture in Blender is that it naturally doesn't show the seams of where I cut for the UV. I try to put them in hidden areas, but of course they are bound to be seen somewhere. And so my method is just to strategically go back and forth between the two programs as needed, reloading it in Blender and then building up all of the detail. When I create the image in Blender, I always start off with a transparent image, so when I'm going between the two programs I can make use of clipping masks and alpha lock as I need, and also so that way when I'm completely done with the texture and I add in a layer underneath it in Clip Studio to add in the fill color for that cat. And you'll see me do that is adding a border of color all around the different parts of the texture, and this is because those 2D UV pieces, or UV islands as they're called, they aren't pixel perfect, and if you're familiar then you can kind of think of them as vector lines on top of a raster image. And so sometimes they can pick up on the pixels outside of their island on the texture. And this is just a way to ensure that if they do pick up on the pixel on the outside, then it's going to at least be a color very similar to the neighboring pixels that it should be, and so it shouldn't be noticeable at all. And here's just a quick demonstration of that, since I feel like it's hard to explain. The things that I took from making Fran was that the texture space in the nose area was way too small and it turned out quite pixelated, and overall I upped the size of the whole image so that was a bit higher resolution. Originally I was just doing it in 1024 by 1024 pixels, and I upped that to 1200, and that seemed to be pretty good. I import my sketch as a guide and I have a split window here so that way I can always see how it lines up on the front view while I'm panning around and posing the rig. I really wanted to put her and Sophie in this one specific duo pose that I did. I think it fits their dynamic really well. Sophie hated Fran at first when we got her, but has since come to tolerate her, but no matter how mean Sophie is to Fran, she is still Fran's best friend. She's obsessed with her. So, speaking of Sophie, let's move on to texturing her. She's got quite a complex coat. She is a tortoiseshell tabby, so she's got tabby markings on top of the tortoiseshell coat. But this is a good point, I think, to mention that most of the cats that I'm making are secretly symmetrical. I put care and attention into the face and take note of the slightly non-symmetrical markings, but when it comes to the body, most of the cats are only ever going to be seen from one side. So to put it quite bluntly, I'm not going to be wasting my time on things that don't matter. If there's quite iconic markings, especially if I can see with the legs that they are different between the left and the right, of course I'm going to put that detail in. There's some cats that you see them from the back, so of course having the coat not symmetrical there will be very, very noticeable. It just comes down to what I need to do for each specific cat. Now at this point, I'm still being quite experimental with how I'm drawing the markings here, and this is only my second cat. I don't have a method down pat or anything yet. And to be fair, I think I can even say that for the last few cats that I do. I've been experimenting throughout this whole thing. I have certain methods that stay the same, but I do experiment quite a bit with different techniques, whatever is going to get a good representation of the cat's coat while still stylizing it. For the base of Sophie's coat, I'm keeping things quite jagged and rough to bring in the chaotic nature of her markings. The base is a diluted brown with the darker tabby stripes and a lighter underbelly, and then on top with the orange, I changed the opacity on the brush to roughen the orange patches. Oh, and a big revolutionary idea that I had was to name all the cats as I go before I start forgetting them. Blender has a text object that you can literally just write whatever text you want and pick whatever font you want as well, and I put them on a curve modifier and adjust the curve to just follow the shape of the cat. Sandy is the very first Artfight cat that I made, and as you can see, I'm still being quite experimental with the markings. At this stage, I'm still trying to keep things simple and stylized, so that way it's easy to replicate for all the other future cats. Sandy has a light base color and a slightly darker tabby stripes, and an even lighter underbelly. After I drew all the markings for Sophie, I made a template image from that texture for things like the nose, the mouth, the inner ears, and the toe beans, so that way I can import this template onto each new cat and to save time not drawing the exact same details over and over and over again. And do change them up, like especially the eye pupils, for most of the cats. After the texture is all completed, I choose a spot on the sketch and position the rig accordingly, but you may notice that some things look a little wonky. Some poses look better than others, but for most, if not all of the cats, I go in after the posing is done to edit the model itself to sit a bit nicer and just look a little bit better. I made a little fence post stump for him to sit on out of just a basic cylinder with a couple of extra simple little details. The next cat is Squeakers, a sweet little tuxedo kitty. I start off his texture with symmetry to get the bulk of it down, but turn it off when it comes to detailing the face. I decided that I wanted Squeakers to be in the bottom stretching pose, and so I opted not to make the eyes for this one. The next cat is named Solma, a lovely grey kitty, which I consider quite a simple cat. There's these two very specific photos that made me think that the stretching and yawning pose was going to be perfect for her, but cat faces are like super weird when they yawn, like really weird. So I messed around with it for quite a while to try and get it looking right. Still not entirely happy with it even in the end, but I just couldn't wrap my head around what I needed to do to make it read more as a yawn. An open mouth needs that. I needed to model some teeth. They aren't anything fancy, just a cube extruded into shape and then mapped to a solid teeth color section on the texture map. They don't have any special texture to them. The sixth cat that I'm working on here is Cranberry, the first calico colored cat. Again, enabling symmetry is a good way to get the bulk of the texture in first before moving to the non-symmetrical elements. I get the orange and the black patches in first. She also has some very faint tabby lines, so I put my brush into Multiply to paint them over the two colors. While Blender doesn't work in layers unless you have a plugin to do so, you can put the brush itself into the different blend modes like Multiply, Overlay, Screen, all of those kinds of things, and it really does come in handy a lot. Another handy thing is changing the fall off of the brush, so sometimes you want a harsh solid brush, while other times you want a softer fluffier brush, and that is changed with the curve graph. It is at this point that I come back the next day with fresh eyes and decide that something needs to change. The models just look a little bland, so I add in an outline to each one by duplicating each of the models and inflating it a little bit so it's just a tiny bit larger than that of the base model. Flip the normals on that new outline model so that way it's inside out, and then assigning a new material with backface culling enabled so that way you only see the insides of the faces. Then I change up the shader for the cats themselves to be a bit more cartoony, cel-shaded by plugging the base of the shader into a shader to RGB node and then into a color ramp node. multiplying that by the texture image, and that's pretty much the shader. It's pretty simple. It's basically taking the shading on a white base model, converting that to the gradient colors that I choose. In this case, it's just like a straight change between a white and then a gray. And this can pretty much be set up however you want, but I chose a constant mode, so that way there was no gradient change between them, it was just one or the other. And then the mix node set to multiply acts like a multiply layer in Photoshop or Clip Studio Paint. It's taking the image and multiplying it over the top of that gradient color. Luckily, I decided to pivot the art style early enough in the project, so you'll see me add the shader to all the cats as I go. I just copy it from one to the next and adjust it as needed. Cat number 7 is Arrow, another grey kitty who is making my life easy right now. I do try to limit the amount of more simple cats that I'm doing so it doesn't feel too much like a cop-out, but you know, sometimes I do need a break and refresh with something simple. Cassie is up next. She's another calico kitty who leans a little bit more on the tortoiseshell side with her head markings. Someone mentioned in a comment that the calico and tortoiseshell coat are controlled by the same gene, and it's mainly the amount of white that determines the kind of pattern that's shown. More white tends to be more rounded patches that are typical of calico, while less white is more chaotic markings typical of tortoiseshell cats. Now, take that with a grain of salt. I only did a little bit of my own research on this, but I thought that was quite fascinating. When it came time to posing her, this is when I kind of ran into some limitations with the rig, trying to pose her into this tightly curled up ball. But a fun little workaround that I can do is go into each of the spine bones and disconnect them, so that way I have a little bit of extra length and movement. So rather than just rotating from each pivot point, they can be separated to give me a little bit of extra length. Lion is a very interesting cat, and it may just be the lighting, but his coat has this very real metallic-y looking sheen to it that I was very excited to reproduce. I start out with just the basic markings and then blend in some lighter brown over the black, and then add in some individual strands of like a gold color. I also need to break his rig a little bit to put him on the pose on top of the fence pose, but it's a silly goofy pose and I love it. Next cat is Athena. She's another quite simple white cat, but I wanted to include her for her heterochromia as she's the first one that I have found so far. Her outline and shader also gets a bit of an edit to go and be a little bit softer for her. I don't have a lot else to say about her, but maybe that's not such a bad thing. I do have 86 more cats to get through anyway, so I'll try and speed run things a little bit. Luna is a good example of why this piece is only seen from the front, and not all poses look good from all angles. I like to compare it to a movie set, where buildings are just facades and effort doesn't go into the things behind the scenes that aren't going to be shown on the screen. To get the pose looking good from the front, the legs need to come forward a bit more and the shoulders look weird, and that's mainly also a limitation from my rigging, but again, you're only seeing it from the front, so I kind of don't care. Speaking of weird poses, Pippin's is a weird one, but more on that in a moment. When it comes to tabby stripes, I'm not trying too hard to get every stripe exactly as pictured on the references, but more their general vibes. The face I do try and get accurate. I feel like those forehead tabby stripes are as unique and specialized fingerprints and that they mean a lot to some people, but with the body I look more to what kind of tabby stripes they are. Pippin's are quite thin, long and unbroken, and they tapered off towards the paws where they turn into just dots essentially. Now, his pose was based on a specific photo that I found of a cat standing up and stretching on top of a fence post. So at first I did make him look like he was taking a shit. Disconnecting all of the spine bones, however, gave me a little bit more room to move and to get him into a better pose, and I feel like it's now accurate. Next up is a cat named Chester, and he's got a tiny little white patch of fur on his chest, though I don't think you could even call it a patch, more like just a few white strands. And he's also got some very faint dark tabby stripes in his coat as well, which was a fun little detail. You may have noticed as well that I've started to be a little bit more experimental with the eyes and trying to make each one a little bit more unique with some fun shaped highlights. Now, this next cat takes the award of the most chaotic description I think I've read during this whole entire project, and it's only fitting that she is a tortoiseshell. This is Misconduct. Quote, "Misconduct is the thing that lives in my house. It is roughly 4 years old and invades my privacy. Its only thoughts are food and crimes. It is bad, it is bad, it is bad. Nickname, Stink, Bad, Terrible, Horrible, Unpleasant, Stupid, Stink, Bad, Mean, Unkind, Crap Butt, Bad. It is female, question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark. It probably came from a lab. We love it dearly." And I think that is beautiful. It really just goes to show that there are two kinds of cat owners in this world. So this grooming pose I thought was going to be incredibly fitting, and I gave her a little tongue as well. Jumping straight from one tortoiseshell to the next, we have here Winnie, who I think has the most adorable face I have ever seen on a cat ever. Sorry to all of the other 95 cats here, but can you really disagree? Something about her checkerboard pattern mouth just really highlights how round her mouth looks and gives her a smile, paired with those big round green eyes, and I just want to squish her face. She has a lot of orange in her coat as opposed to black. I pretty much zoned out for the half hour it took to add in those larger rough patches of orange, bridged together by these smaller strokes, and then back in with strokes of black over the patches of orange. I think it gave it a cool effect, and this is pretty much how I handle tortoiseshell coats in the future as well. I've been kind of waiting for the point in this video where we get up to this cat here, Tater Tot. Not only does he have a cute name, but this is the point where I start really getting into a groove and more confident. Because his name is Tater Tot, I thought it would be a brilliant idea to make the highlights in his eyes little potato shapes. An idea that I will be continuing on wherever possible for all the cats in the future. His description very specifically said that he wears a red collar with a gold bell on it. The simplest way to get the base was to just duplicate out a ring of faces around the neck and build off of that. The shape is already there, and it will have the important data like the weight painting there as well. The bell is just a simple cube with two subdivisions to make it round and smooth, and then a couple of torus objects as rings to join them together. The next cat that I wanted to include was a special cat, as she is blind. However, her owner also had a second cat, a fluffy ragdoll, and so it only felt right to include both of them together. While originally I was planning on avoiding fluffy cats entirely and just including short hairs, it was about time that I actually added in some variety. I've duplicated out my base template to work separately on this new fluffy template. I decided where I want to add some of the extra fluffy bits to be, like on the side of the face, the joints in the legs, and the chest, and personally I'd like to duplicate these faces out into a new object so that way I can work on them isolated from everything else. Then I'm just taking individual faces and extruding them out into little clumps of fluff-shaped pieces. I'm also making the rest of the body a little bit rounder, but not fat, it's just extra fluff. My favourite part ended up being the tail, probably because that's what I did last and so I already had my method down pat, but after it's all done, I do a very messy job of merging back the bits that I separated it out, unwrapping it again, and fixing up all of the weights. I say a very messy job because I really should have spent more time refining the weights and getting them to sit nicely, because it was a lot of fixing up for each cat to go in the future, especially with the more dramatic poses and where there's like a lot of movement with the front legs, and you will see that there's a fair bit of fixing up on some of them. Since I've just made the fluffy cat model, we will start with Rum Tum, a very fluffy ragdoll cat. Unlike with the short hair cats, I'm also bringing in fluffy detail in the texture as well. Now this cat, Hinata, is the reason I made the fluffy cat to start with. She's a gorgeous calico tabby, so I start with the grey-brown base and block out where her orange patches mostly are, then layer over the top of that with the grey-brown multiply brush for the tabby stripes, before putting in her white chest, underbelly and paws. Her owner describes her eyes as big, beautiful, silvery orbs, and this is where the inspiration took me, bringing in some subtle, rainbowy colours and plenty of reflective orbs. To polish this duo up after they're posed together, I go back in and adjust anything that's intersecting, so that way they mesh together a little bit nicer. We're already up to cat number 19, and we can always do with some more orange cats to ensure there's enough brain cells to go around. This is Tigger. And like I've always said, if you are going to describe your cat as probably plotting world domination as we speak, then it's only fitting that I put fire in the highlights of their eyes. You may also be wondering at this point if all of the cats are starting to get in the way and if I'm ever going to move or hide them. The answer is yes, and then no. This is a cat that requires a decent amount of editing to the base. He is aptly named Big Mike. I mainly focus on making the main body rounder and fatter, while parts like the legs get shorter and the face gets smaller to give the illusion of him being even larger again. Because I knew what pose I wanted him to be sitting in, and that pose originally didn't show the cat's face, I took a little bit of a shortcut and didn't do the eyes or any of the face markings, but it just felt wrong to not include it, so I added them in later and then I turned his head slightly so that way you can still see some of the details. Let's go back to some fluffy cats! Chip is both gorgeous and also on the more simple side, so I try and add in as much detail as I can with some extra fur detail and some pink tones in the face. This point is about where I start realizing that while the blocky, bubbly kind of aesthetic that I was going for in the beginning was nice, that's with the coats, not the models, gradients do just make everything look so nice, especially for this brown tabby, Jelly. Jelly is short for Angelica, so her special eye highlights are little halos. Her pose is a little bit improvised just because I didn't like the angry bushy one that I had sketched out and it doesn't really fit the vibe that I'm going with anymore. You're going to see a few ragdolls now because I love ragdolls and the couple that I've done so far just weren't enough for me. First up is Domino's 2-for-1 Tuesdays, or Domino for short. And a running theme that you may notice, especially because ragdolls usually have darker points and quite light bodies, is that I like to block in the different colours as a guide, and then use that guide to put gradients in for nice smooth colours in Clip Studio Paint. Domino's description said that she was a bit of a drama queen, so I used a cylinder to form the base of a little crown, extruding up the little points and then adding a solidify modifier for some thickness. The little accessories like this is something that I would have liked to continue and do a little bit more of, but I didn't find too many opportunities to do that. For this next ragdoll, Pearl, they had a very nice drawn reference for him, making it easier for me to just colour pick straight from the reference and go from there. He also has a collar like Tater Tot did, but I didn't want it to be a simple copy paste, so I did the same steps to replicate it. I used a ring of faces from the body as a base, and then a torus ring to join the tag to the collar. He is also a very good example of how a more extreme pose is just pushing this rig to its limits, especially for the fluffy cats, and that there's a lot of fixing up and positioning to make it look decent again. Let's do Mara, the next ragdoll of the day, and this time I'm trying to bring in all of the different shades that she has in as a gradient while keeping it kind of loose and organic and fluffy looking. Mulchi is up next, and she may have been part ragdoll, she may not have been, I don't actually know, but I still think she's super cute and a little bit different as a short hair with ragdoll-like markings. I also did something a little bit special for Mulchi because she has passed away, but her favourite toy was a little pink flamingo. I just googled cat flamingo toys and this was one of the more prominent designs that came up, so that's what I went with. I'm still not done with ragdolls, however. This next fluffy cat is Kiki. I did also go to the trouble of making her a collar, but you don't really see it in the pose that I put her in, unfortunately, but I do love the pose that she's in. I did steal Pearl's collar as a base since they are both fluffy cats, and I changed the tag over for a heart. An easy way to make a heart I have found is to rotate a square 45 degrees and then extrude out the top edge a couple of times to make it round. With the mirror modifier and a few little refinements, it starts to come together pretty quickly as a heart. When it comes to the black cats, I do try and make them as unique as possible. With Hades here, he only had the one reference photo, but from that I could see some slight brown shades on his chest, so I leaned into that a little bit so that his body wasn't all just one solid colour. Again, I didn't like this one specific pose, so I just winged it and gave him a simple sit pose, which opens up a little bit of space next to him that I will fill in later. This next cat is Whisper, and as usual I'm building the coat up in layers. A grey base to start, darker tabby lines on top, and then all of the white markings over the top of that. Now it's time for the first live stream. I won't go too much into detail for these guys, but I have a live stream day to get done as many cats as I could to start really filling some things out. I think in the end I made 9 cats in the 6-hour stream, plus a couple that I did before the stream as a warm-up, so it was a good day. First up is Leonard and Crandall, who I forgot to rename the text until later, don't worry about that. These two brothers are going to start filling in the section of yarn kitties. Ira is next. She's an adorable little bobtail kitty. The pose I put her in originally I swapped with Eleanor and they just meshed together a little bit better. This little tortoiseshell cutie is Zoe. Hiccup takes the award for my favourite pose in this whole entire piece. Lucy has a really cool white face marking. Apparently I didn't show off shrimp very well, so this is the best you get. And lucky last is Willow, who for now is going to be all the way at the top and the culprit of this whole yarn fiasco, but we'll start filling it in more so she isn't out on her own. I am so excited for these next 2 cats, and I think you will start to see why. First up is Tiger Kaka, and I think I'm saying that right, I may not be, but we'll never know. I thought she was really interesting as she's a La Perm, giving her this unique curly coat. I didn't give her a unique base, but I did take the tail from the fluffy base and put it onto the short hair body. I found it quite difficult to see where her patches of colour were, so getting that down as the base was a little bit messy, but then I'm just experimenting with getting that curly look to it. I generally just went over the borders of the 2 colours with these curly squiggly lines, and then over it again in the second colour. There was one specific part of her description that stood out to me, and that was that she is very good at loafing and sleeping like a croissant, which you would think would be a very good excuse to put little bread loaves or croissants in the highlights of her eyes, but instead I have an even better opportunity. I had this little pose sketched out of a cat wearing a croissant hat, and it's perfect, really, you can't deny that. To make the croissant hat, it starts out as a cylinder with the wedge sections extruded out to create the grooves between the layers of the pastry. It's really pretty basic when you break it down into its simple shapes. And now it's time to make her brother, Emilio. I wanted to do something a little bit special for him as well, since Tiger Kaka had the croissant hat, so I've got a pose sketched out next to the croissant hat of a cat holding a knife in its mouth, so that's where Emilio is gonna go. And I do think it matches the description of him being, quote, very dumb and stupid, but we love him anyways. The knife is also pretty simple to make. It's a relatively flat object, so I just make the shape out of a plane and extrude it back once I'm happy with it, make the handle part a little thicker, and then merge the vertices along the sharpest point of the knife together to make it, well, sharp. Most, if not all of these cats are still very memorable to me. If you showed me a picture of one of these cats, I could probably tell you their name, but this one here, Bilbo Boggins, aka Bog, will probably be one that I remember literally forever, both the cat himself and the description for him. His descriptions opens with, quote, he is from Kansas, so he's oddly proportioned. Eyes too big, ears too small, a long body, and a tail only half the length it should be. And when I was editing this, I'm only just now realizing that Bog has a sibling, which I obviously didn't include, and now I feel bad. I think maybe I just got so caught up in his ridiculous description that I just completely skipped over checking if their owner had another cat, and now I feel bad. I believe this is where I started getting comments on the shorts that I was posting here and over on TikTok. A lot of these comments being suggestions from other artists participating in Artfight who wanted their cats included as well. The first 2 are Artemis and Apollo. Again, I don't have a duo pose set up for them, but they go next to each other as yarn kitties. Next is Lucifer, which I think is a super fun name for a cat. He's a smoky black Maine Coon, so I experimented bringing in some of the smoky brown tints as clumps of fur. I thought he would fit very well as one of the first tree kitties, as he was described as being very adventurous. For Kada, I kept the colours to soft brown tones with really rough longer strokes. I also really liked how her eyes turned out and the star highlights were really cute, but in the end, with the pose that I wanted to put her in, I decided to give her closed eyes instead. Oreo is up next. I don't have a lot to say for him, but I love the little black and pink toe beans, and his name also gives me a good opportunity to put in some creative eye highlights again. Miyuki was another quite experimental one for me. She looks like a diluted tortoiseshell like Kata is, so her pattern is very soft looking. I use a grey as a base and a light orange for the tortoiseshell patches on a low opacity compared to how I've been drawing them so far, and just blobbing in little patches of orange and then blending them back in with the grey over the top. I shuffled her pose around a little bit. I felt she took up a little bit too much space, which means I'll be able to fit in yet another cat in at a later time. I'm really excited for this next batch of cats too. The first one is Jupiter. I love the name. She's got this gorgeous orange tabby coat with black patches of hair mixed in. Now, I can't remember what compelled me to choose to put Jupiter in this specific pose, but I did decide that she is going to take on the role of the cat in the wizard hat. Maybe it was the stars and the moon that I wanted to put on the hat, tying it back to space and to Jupiter. I actually can't remember, but I think it does suit her well, and I love how the hat looks on her. Going next to Jupiter will be a black cat named Sydney. The pose was originally going to be a cat wearing bunny ears, but Sydney already had a bunch of reference pictures of him wearing different costumes, one of them being a dinosaur costume, which I loved. I just thought it was too cute, so I had to do it. Just like with the collars, but just a little bit more complicated, I select out faces from the body that form the main shape of the costume, then duplicate that out as a new object to begin working on it. It just needs a little bit of fixing and adjustments to take the shape that I want it to, and I make a few little dinosaur spines and give it a texture to match. With his little dinosaur costume, he also gets little dinosaur highlights in his eyes, and that's 4 of the 6 costume cats done, along with Taikakaka and Emilio, and I'll get to the other 2 a little bit later. The next cat is Piria, I think that's how it's pronounced, and I'm kind of mixing the usual tortoiseshell kind of technique with longer strokes of her long fur. It ended up being a little bit too harsh for my liking, so I toned it back down a bit by overlaying some black. She also has just one singular white whisker while her others are black, which I think is super neat. I only ever came across one other cat like that, but he is towards the end of the project. I really loved how silvery and metallic-y Trixie looked in her reference photos, so I tried to replicate that by emphasizing the highlights and the shading on the mesh itself to make the grey pop a little bit more. Ponyo is another cat that has super unique face markings. The first thing that came to my mind was of course Studio Ghibli's Ponyo, so she gets a little wave in the highlight of her eyes. Apparently I didn't write anything for this next cat, Lottie Neen. I just wrote down her name and nothing to go along with her. But I put her in this little outstretched scratching pose on the bottom of the tree. William is the first cat that I've come across with those really thick banded tabby stripes that I really love. How many times have I said love in this voiceover, I swear. But that's all I've written for him as well. Honestly, he's probably the first cat that I've forgotten about. Like, I don't even think I showed him off on any of my TikTok or Shorts videos either. He was kind of just buried, unfortunately, and I kind of feel bad for that. I wish I could say I had more rhyme and reason to what I was doing, but where I've just been focusing on bridging to fill out the tree kitties, I'm now back to doing the last 2 cats in silly hats. In Charlotte's description, it says, quote, "Yes, put her in silly accessories and outfits." And so that's really just the perfect opportunity to put her in a frog hat. The green even matches her eyes. I decided this time to make the hat from scratch rather than taking a template from the base mesh. It's pretty much just a simple cube with a subdivision modifier to make it round, with the front face of the cube deleted so that way you can see the head of the cat poking through. I also added in little stitches in the texture so that way it at least looks a little bit more like those silly little crochet hats, which is where I was drawing my inspiration from. So naturally, let's move on to the very last of the cats in silly hats. Oliver here is going to be in a little crochet sunflower hat, and this is the source of the yarn for all of the yarn kitties. Willow at the top is pulling the thread out from his little hat, and the yarn has made its way all the way down through this selection of kitties, most of them joining in and playing, and there's some that are just tangled up and sleeping. I do hesitate to say tangled up. Of course, these kitties are in no danger and it's all in good fun, but this amount of yarn, of course, would be quite a worry for a cat to be playing with in real life. Pivoting back to the tree kitties, like I said, no rhyme or reason to this, I just went wherever my inspiration took me. Heidi is another very fluffy black cat that I'm going to be adding in, though I found it quite difficult to pose her without a tree for reference there, so I guess it's time to stop procrastinating that. Luckily, the sketch that I have is pretty good. It's at least easy to follow by using my trusty cylinder and extruding it along the sketch as a guide. I don't know if there's a proper way to make the forks in a tree. It's not like I googled how do I make a fork in a tree in Blender, but I've made sure the cylinder lined up to the base of the fork and then split the top face in half where each of the new branches will come out from, and make sure they are circular before extruding them out too far. It's a bit messy how I got there, but I did get there in the end and it looks great, so it's fine. Pickles is another big fluffy Maine Coon that I'm putting up in the tree, and I love that he also has those thick and bold tabby markings that I don't see enough of, if I'm honest. Moving on up the tree, we have Polly. That's all I've written for her. That's all I got. I could not resist putting Princess in as my next tree cat. Again, another fluffy cat going up in the tree, but this reference picture was the exact pose that I had sketched out of a cat in the fork of a tree, so I just had to. She's got some definite layers happening with her coat, which I love. Again, gradients just make everything look so much nicer. And lately, I've been liking drawing in the tabby lines with pen pressure on rather than just a solid opacity. Again, it just adds a little bit more detail with little to no effort. I think that Anakin is an amazing name for a cat, and here he is. It's actually pretty perfect that some of the surrounding tree cats took up less room than I expected, that there was just enough room to fit him in. Originally, I didn't want any of the cats hanging from the tree. I thought that that was just a little bit too much, a little bit too cruel, but come on, this cat's name is Anakin. It's literally perfect. About halfway through this project, I had a comment on one of my TikTok shorts that I was posting asking how I would go about making a Sphinx cat. At the time, I had said that I wasn't sure and that I would see where the inspiration took me if I ever came across one, but I was secretly hoping that I didn't find one. So, to my surprise, just a few days after that, I stumbled across this gorgeous tortoiseshell Sphinx cat, and I really considered if I was actually just gonna skip over her, but I really just couldn't resist. She is absolutely adorable. And so, the challenge of making a Sphinx cat base. First things first is to remove the whiskers and then shrink down the base just a little bit, not in size, but with the shrink fatten tool that makes it skinnier rather than smaller. Just drawing on the wrinkles wouldn't be enough, so I also incorporate them into the model itself, and this is done mostly by extruding certain sections, following where the wrinkles would be, and then I merge one side back into the body to create more overlapping folds. And so this is the gorgeous girl Raven who made me pull the trigger and actually make a unique model for a Sphinx. I love that her little pink patches of skin shows where her tortoiseshell fur would have been, or at least I'm assuming that's the case, but she actually has a little tiny bit of fur left on her face, bringing in some of the typical tortoiseshell colours. She also has heterochromia. It's a little bit subtle, one eye is blue and the other is green. And then with her base colours down, I go back in and accentuate those wrinkles in the model and add in just a little bit more detail with the multiply brush. Since I've now gone to the trouble of making a new base, I went and searched for some more Sphinx cats to include. So next up we have Xandis, and a little bit of a side quest that I had is that I wanted to have a cat for every letter of the alphabet in here. Xandis for X is quite a unique name. Spoiler alert though, I did not get every letter in here. There is a few that I'm missing by the end, but that's okay. Surprisingly, I didn't find a cat for the letter N. Q, I technically did have a cat suggested to me, but I won't say the name and I just didn't feel comfortable including it in this piece. I also didn't have U and Y. So really that's only 4, and I'm sure if I tried harder I probably could have completed this little side quest as well. For one last Sphinx cat, this here is Finnegan. That's all I've written for him as well. Now it's time to jump through a little recap of a second live stream that I did, working on getting a bulk of the remaining cats done. First up is this gorgeously coloured cat, Mia, I think it's pronounced. Luna and Misty come as a pair. This of course wasn't a pose I intended on doing at the start, but I just hated the box pose that they're now covering up. I did give Amel a little bit of a plaid collar later on, even though you can only see a tiny bit of it in his pose. And lucky last for the day is Lily in this silly goofy zoomy pose. Now I've got a kitten base and I'm going to use it. I came across a trio of kittens, and again I didn't originally plan on adding kittens, but I found this really cute pose that I'm going to put them in. They're all quite young in their reference photos, so I'm sure that they will look quite different to how I've drawn them when they get older, and I will admit it was a little bit of a challenge trying to interpret their coats as is. The first one is Pinoir, then Pasha, the little tuxedo kitten. No, Peeps is the tuxedo kitten, and then Pasha is the grey tabby. For Frumpkin's brown tabby coat, I bring in the lighter underbelly with a lower opacity and a soft brush. With the darker tabby stripes, I'm keeping it a bit more loose with individual strokes making up the stripes rather than the more solid that I've gone for so far. Then he's got his little white feet and chin. His pose is, I think, also another one of my favourites. He's just doing a big old stretch. I will be completely upfront about this cat here, Cora. I'm a little disappointed with the level of detail in her coat. I didn't know what it was, but I think being at the end of the day and nearing the end of the project, I just called it a day without putting in as much detail as some of the others, like gradients and more organic tabby stripes. Especially since she had a tortoiseshell tabby coat, there was heaps going on there, and she's just looking a little bit flat. I went back in at the end when I was polishing up the whole piece and added in some more detail, but I really should have just gone back and redone the full coat. This next pair of cats is absolutely adorable. It's Romeo and Pixie. Pixie is first. He is a white cat with yellow eyes. Pretty easy. And then we move on to Romeo, which is honestly one of the funniest names I've ever heard of for a cat. He is almost fully white with some grey spots. Because the pose I have them in, Romeo is facing away from the camera, I do take a little bit of a shortcut and focus on the markings on his back and skip a lot of the face and the eyes. That's also why I put them in I didn't swap their positions, because then otherwise you'd just be seeing the back of a white cat and that's not too interesting. So that's why you see the front of Pixie and the back of Romeo. Now cue the footage for the one and only cat that I forgot to hit record for. So all I have for Sweets here is posing him on the swing. I guess that means it's a good time to show off some of the refining work that goes into each cat after they are posed. I haven't shown much of it so far because it's mainly not fun to watch, at least in my opinion. It's not as creative as actually drawing the cat's coat, especially in poses like this where the back leg is all bunched up, and since there's technically two models overlapping with the cat itself and then the outline, there's a lot of room for little errors, and it really just makes a difference if I go through and make sure the outline model is over the top of the normal model and not intersecting, and just making the lines more visually pleasing as if it were line art on a 2D image. This next cat, all I have written for is Coda, Siamese. That's it, I'm sorry. Moving on, I got into a little bit of a tortoiseshell tabby phase. I've looked through hundreds and hundreds of different cat character posts and surprisingly came across a few that had the same kind of coat that Sophie has. So this one here is Birdie, who also gives me a chance to use the kitten base again. Sushi is the next tortoiseshell tabby, and she has more broken and spotty looking tabby lines than any of the other tabbies that I've done so far. Moving on from the tortoiseshell tabbies for now though, I love this next trio. Riddick is the adult black cat, and he is accompanied by two kittens, V the calico and Osprey the tuxedo kitten. I am in love with Osprey, mainly because of the detail that went into the mouth, inspired by multiple of his reference pictures being of him yawning or screaming. I can't tell the difference. I definitely stepped it up from the last open mouth cat that I made, Selma, right at the beginning. Yawning cats are just weird. So there's just a lot of pushing and pulling the mouth to get it into a shape that looks at least half decent, and then adding in some rudimentary cubes to shape the teeth and a plane for a long curly tongue. They all get a similar pose as they are just sitting in a line next to each other, and being able to copy the pose from one cat to the next really makes my life a little bit easier and get a head start on the pose, and then just making adjustments to make it unique. I've got another random kitten size gap to fill, and Andromeda is going to do that for me. Since her name is so long and the description specifically referred to her nickname being Andy, I had to shorten it to fit, but I think it's cute. The name, that is, and the cat. But Andy is a cute name for a cat. Andy is going to be the last yarn kitty in this section of the piece, and overall this is actually pretty close to the end of the project, so time to get some yarn in. This is just made with a curve with lots of extruding and bending to go from one cat to the next, following my reference and having all of the cats along the way either playing with it, trying to eat it, or just being wrapped up in this long piece of yarn. I had Eden and Carly sitting in my open tabs for such a long time, and I'm finally getting to include them as some of the last few cats. I'm an absolute menace when it comes to having tabs open in Google Chrome, especially for this project. I had 4 different windows open to keep things organized just for the Artfight cats, and each one had probably about 10 to 20, maybe more, tabs in each one just to keep things organized and making sense for my brain. But for Eden and Carly, these hexagon highlights have no meaning, it was just a random shape that I chose. However, the magic in making the hexagon is simply a circle selection filled in with white, with a symmetry ruler placed in the middle with 6 points of symmetry. Then erase a straight line between where those symmetry lines intersect the circle, and ta-da! You have a hexagon! They both get hexagon highlights to kind of tie them in together because I don't have a duo pose for them, but they do get 2 silly goofy tree poses right next to each other. Again, it would be interesting to know how many times I've said silly goofy in this voiceover. Up next is another duo, Misha and Fluffsky. Their owner, Red Spectrum, gifted me a couple of pieces of art that I really love of my 2 cats. So I consider this an unofficial revenge or a thank you of sorts. I did Misha first as he seemed the easier of the 2, and I cannot tell you why I did a fish as the eye highlights in the Artfight website is down, so I can't even double check the description. It was probably something along the lines of him having a favorite toy that was a fish. That feels vaguely familiar. I will admit though, I think Fluffsky ended up being one of my favorites. The combination of all of the different shades and the opacity and the fluffy look to it, I just think his coat ended up looking awesome. One more orange cat to add in here. Charlie has thick bold tabby stripes, and we will most definitely not be watching me pose him on the rope of this swing. I struggled a lot, and even though I was looking at a reference image, he was just real awkward to pose. Oh no, apparently I didn't record much of this cat either, but a modified kitten base was perfect for this round little British short hair Sheila. I kind of just kept the rounder proportions of the kitten but made it look like halfway between a kitten and the base adult cat template. I don't know why that was so hard to say. I don't think I showed off this pose in the sketching phase right at the very beginning of this video. But this pose was 2 cats fighting, and I specifically wrote next to them on the sketch that they were fighting because it may have looked a little bit suspicious. That pose never grew on me, so I'm freehanding this pose instead, and I'm much happier for it. Scion's acrobatics pose leaves enough of a gap underneath for a little bean to fill in, and he's kind of mimicking the same pose, but they aren't a duo or related or anything. I just thought it was cute. I actually almost forgot about this little guy. Like I said, they're all memorable to me, but there's 96 to keep track of. His name is Goose. And now it is just down to the last 3 cats, finally, the holy trio. This was the only trio that I had planned to put in here, although obviously plans change and I have put another 2 of the trios in here up until now. But I have been so excited to fill this space since the very beginning. I had it narrowed down to 3 sets of cats, and it was difficult to choose which 3 I was going to put in here, but in the end I did go with 3 that were a little bit more visually interesting, to put it quite blunt. In this trio, we've got a black cat Gomez, an orange and white cat Spike, and a calico named Tinkerbell. So now that all of the cats are done, there's actually still a fair bit of work left in it for me. I wanted to fill in the smaller gaps around with little toys and items, like this little spring toy that's made out of a cylinder. The cylinder, I break 2 of the vertices and offset it a little bit, and then put an array modifier on it so that way it duplicates it all the way up, and then apply that, join it together, and then the whole spiral is split in half with the loop cut. Removing one of those loops will leave half of the spiral. There's a roll of toilet paper, which is also just made from starting with the cylinder and adding some embellishments. There's also these little fish toys. They just seem like those cheap ones that you can get pretty much anywhere online, but they were fitting nonetheless. They were just very simple flat planes, and I have an image imported as reference to trace the shape of, essentially. I'm returning back to my trusty cylinder once again to model a ballpoint pen, which to some may seem random, but I'm sure there are plenty of other cat owners out there that have a cat obsessed with pens. At least I know that Fran, my cat, is. She will run around the house holding them in her mouth and meowing and batting them around everywhere. There's also this small little detail that may or may not be noticed, but where there is normally writing on the barrel of the pen, I have text saying, "Why cat love pen?" There's also a lot of refining and cleaning up work to do. Where I originally had all of the cats outlined in a simple black material, it was just a bit too harsh, especially on the cats with white or lighter coats. And then for cats with multiple colours, like black and white tuxedo cats, the black was too harsh on the white sections, and a lighter outline that matched the white was too light for the black. So I went around for each individual cat, giving them a new outline colour, and then selectively applying different outline materials to match the patterns on the coats. Putting it all together now, and I had this vision late one night. It's just one of those 3 AM ideas, and I'm like, I need to remember this. Surely this is gonna look amazing. This whole piece needed a background of sorts, but I still wanted it to be abstract. So I put together this really low resolution image of a sky and some grass, and color picked from that image to create individual cutouts around each of the cats, almost as if they were stickers. I think this helped separate some of them to give them their own spotlight while still looking cohesive. And then all that's really left is fixing up some bits that I'm unhappy with from the 3D portion. There's some outlines that just didn't sit right, the shading on the tree needs fixing, just those kinds of things. To me, this is also a piece of art just as any 2D art piece. It is made in 3D, but it does also need to stand on its own. And nothing negative or any hate or anything towards any other 3D artists, but to me, I feel like there's not much that a recipient can do with just a screenshot from Blender or a 3D turnaround. Like, it's great you made it in 3D, but now what? And I guess that's just one of the ways that I try and stand out and make this unique. All in all, this was such a wild ride of a project. From having an ambitious idea 2 weeks into Artfight started, to making more than what was planned, finishing just shy of 100 cats with 96 in total, and I did that all in just 2.5 weeks. Am I allowed to say that I think I'm insane? And I did the math as well. I have 52.5 hours worth of footage, which was a pain to sort through and edit, by the way. That's not the point. 52.5 hours plus 2 6-ish hour live streams, plus I gave up recording at the end when it was just getting repetitive and it wasn't the creative and unique process of making each of the cats, and it was just the 2D editing. So there's probably around 70 hours in this project, maybe some more, and I don't regret it one bit, and I'm excited to do something with a little bit more planning for next year's Artfight. For now though, it's been like 3 to 4 weeks since finishing this project, and I'm still incredibly burnt out, so I'll return with some new exciting projects sometime in the future. I do appreciate you taking the time of your day to watch this video and for your support throughout this project. Happy time zone, and I'll see you in the next video. Also, my voice is a little bit ruined now. I don't know why it's so hard to talk.